All right. Hello and welcome everyone to another chat and learn here with Power to Fly. My name is Mariella Marie, and as always, super excited to roll into this next hour with you all. I briefly chatted with our guest speaker. I know she's going to share a lot of knowledge. She's calling from Seattle, Washington today. She's going to kick us off with a great presentation, and then we're going to roll into your live questions here. We're going to get them answered live. So before we get started, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping rules so that we all feel comfortable and confident in this next hour. We've got folks calling from all over. If you're just joining, go ahead and drop in the chat box. Let us know where you are in the world. And of course, you could be doing anything with your time, but you're deciding to spend the hour with us, whether you're here live with us or whether you're rewatching this. So I encourage you all to be present throughout this next hour and really make use of this time. So, really take notes if you need to, or dive in deep, opening up tabs. I usually say stop multitasking and close tabs, but if you want to open up tabs so you remember to research later and just dig deeper into this conversation, feel free to participate in that way. If you're here live with us, I would invite you to turn your cameras on. You can participate with us that way. Put your virtual backgrounds on, or show your mess, be your authentic self. We would just love to share the virtual time here with you. So you have an invitation to turn your cameras on if you feel called to do so. Otherwise, I invite you all to use the chat box. I've already invited those of you who joined early to feel free to network in the chat box. You can drop any links to your preferred way of connecting or any projects you're working on so that we can be intentional with our time here today. So you have full permission to network in the chat box today. I have muted everyone upon entrance, but I can't stress enough. I would invite you to hop off mute or write in the chat box whenever you have something you want to share. I've just muted everyone upon entrance just to avoid background noise. But again, we want to hear from you. So if you do hop off mute, you will be featured in our live recording as this is being recorded. And I invite you all to share this link when you get the rewatch email. If you signed up for this chat, you'll get a rewatch email with the link to this recorded chat. And then you will get resources as well that our guest speaker is mentioning throughout the hour. So feel free to share that with your community when you have that link. The last thing I'll say is we'd love for you to follow Power to Fly on socials and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can keep up with all the great chats we've got in store. And if this is your first chat where I'm moderating, I'll just take a couple seconds to introduce myself here. So I'm calling from Patagonia in Argentina, the original lands of the Mapuche people, originally from California. And I love speaking about deepening our emotional intelligence at home and in the workplace. So I'm sure that I can kind of bring some of my reflections on emotional intelligence on this conversation. Feel free to philosophize with me if anyone is into that topic. We've got a lot of work to do there. I see our guest speaker nodding our head. So otherwise, I invite you to support the project that I'm working on that is called the Positive Force Team. You can go to thepositiveforceteam.org, sign up for our newsletter, or I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn as well. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our guest speaker who's calling from Seattle, Washington. Aparna, let us know a little bit about yourself, how you came to learn about Power to Fly, and what you're excited to share.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see some familiar names and lots of new ones. Hello, welcome, happy Monday. I'm sure we're all still digesting Thanksgiving leftovers if we're in the US, and we spent time gathering over the past week. My name is Aparna, and I met Power to Fly when it was a baby emerging company. I want to say at like a happy hour at South by Southwest a million years ago, when there were like hundreds of thousands of people in, downtown Austin. And I've just followed along and, really grateful to be part of the community and join you as I'm going to put air quotes around expert, join you as an expert today. My background is in education and adult learning, and I sort of made a sideways pivot into diversity, equity, and inclusion and employee experience work over the last couple of years. In large part because I care about people who look like me and have some of the same identities. I'm an immigrant. I moved here when I was 15 from the Middle East after having lived in a couple of different countries. People that are of color, right? Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I want the world to be a better place for us. I want workplaces in particular to be better for us. And I think that in the chaos of our work lives, there are some, clear pathways to building trust and to having workplaces that work for everybody. So that's, my interest. I want to say like I have some hobbies, but the truth is like I have no hobbies. My favorite thing to do is probably go hiking or be on the water when it's warm outside. I love swimming, and spending time with people and meeting people and learning. So that's a little bit about me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm sure you're going to share more about yourself and your journey as you show us your presentation and then go into these questions. So again, you have full permission to share as much of your journey as you think will be helpful for folks who are listening today. Okay, Aparna, I would love for you to cover the principal themes for today's conversation, and then you can roll right into your presentation.
Awesome. I love it. Okay, so 3 things, right? What are some benefits of it says DEI assessment, right? But to expand on that, like what are the ways in which we can learn more about our people, and that our people could be our teams, they could be our organizations, right? Also, how do we start to use an intersectional analysis to our data so that it guides strategy? One of the things that I love in the work that we do at my company and the direction that I see the world headed in is that we want to use data about people and culture and what isn't working to actually guide strategy. I hate seeing organizations that are locked in cycles of just endless trainings. And for me, like a culture, quarterly culture of training is like signing up for a quarterly boot camp. And if you're somebody who loves working out, you're like, that sounds like a great idea. I'll learn something new. But if you're like me and you really hate working out, at the end of the session, you are super duper sore. And that's the thing that you've taken away from it, right? That my body is sore. I've used muscles that I didn't know I had, and I never want to do it again. Oh, guess what? Like I'm going to do it in like another quarter from now. So really making equity and inclusion work part of the core of what an organization does. And, some best practices, some things that I've seen work around building trust and having greater accountability at work. So those are the things that we're going to talk about. Some of you submitted questions already, so I'm going to weave in the responses in like the quick presentation that we're going to kick off with. And as questions come up, pop them in the chat, right? We don't have to rush through this time together, so we'll just pace it really well.
Absolutely,
Yeah?
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So I stopped sharing my screen. Go ahead and share your screen if you'd like for your presentation. And then folks, as you're listening to the presentation, even if you've already submitted a question, please feel free to submit another one, or if something comes to mind in the moment, drop that in the chat box. And then we're going to go to our live Q&A after the presentation.
Awesome, great. So, when I think about trust at work or trust in general, data is not a word that comes to my mind. And I think that that's true for many of you, right? Like when you think about trust, you're thinking about like the soft, the squishy, the relationship. And over the last couple of years, like a la Brene Brown, who studies courage and shame, we know that a lot of the things that comprise trust are actually quantifiable, and we can measure them, and we need to be able to measure them because trust means different things to different people. And at work, it's really important that we're on the same page, right? So the way that I think about trust in our work is in 2 ways. One, building trust requires that my voice is heard. What I'm thinking, feeling, experiencing, the ways in which I'm being supported or rewarded, that needs to be heard by people who are decision makers and influencers in the organization, right? The second thing that encompasses trust is clarity. Do I know what's going on? Is the leadership being clear with me, right? And over the past year and a half, a lot of us have experienced a lot of ambiguity, right? Like we were like working from home for 6 weeks, then it was 3 months, then it was 6 months, right? And like we've just been in a state of shifting expectations and shifting goalposts about what is and isn't allowed as leaders figure things out as well. So clarity is something that helps build trust. But I would say those are 2 things that aren't happening consistently within organizations. So I want to start with sharing a little bit about what is happening, what's the state of affairs. And for those of you who know me, you know that I love data and I live in my head a lot. So hopefully you can see my slides, right? Awesome. So very recently, Harvard Business Review came out with a really great paper. And one of the things that stood out to me in this paper is a call to organizations to make clear to their employees how their daily decisions are connected to the equity, inclusion, diversity outcomes that they are setting in place, right? It is the responsibility of employers to make it clear to their people. Hold on, let me. Ernst & Young does a lot of research on employee experience, and last year they came out with their own research and their own report, and they said, you really need to start collecting D&I data, right? And it can mean lots of different things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is part of like DEI or D&I data to be strategic, right? This is not an a la carte ad hoc approach. It really needs to be intentional and it really, really needs to be thoughtful. But what is getting in the way? And this is my absolute favorite study. It's a couple of years old at this point. All of it's still really relevant. And this is a Boston Consulting Group. Pretty bold statement. They basically came out and said, what's getting in the way is leadership in organizations, because they lack, at the end of the day, they lack proximity to their workers. They're having a completely different experience, right? Like some of your leaders are living in their second and third homes somewhere in the mountains, escaping the city pandemic life. Like that is very real for a lot of people. Also, like they're going there on their private jet. They don't have proximity to the concerns of people who have caregiving responsibilities and, oh, like now you have to line up for the grocery store, wearing masks, all of the things, right? And if they don't have a clear understanding of the problem, like how could they possibly be designing solutions, right? And so there's a sentence in this report that I just love, which says, you know, leaders typically make decisions based on gut instincts, that are based on their lived experiences, not that of their employees. So how do we move forward, right? And what can we learn from data? One of the things that I discovered, and it's being talked about a lot, is the billions of dollars that's being spent on diversity, equity, inclusion, employee experience, employee voice, employee wellness, like this whole big umbrella of things, right? $8 billion alone on just DEI training and tools last year. That is a lot of money. That's 8B with big billions. We also know that companies are spending money, not just in hiring, but also in employee experience. They're likely to financially outperform their competitors and their comparators. 35% greater returns if you have, you know, representative diversity, which means that your company looks like the community in which it's based, and 15% for gender diversity. So we know that there is a really, really strong case for representative racial and ethnic diversity. And so the work that we do at, you know, Moving Beyond is to help organizations make a case for using data to inform their strategy and practices, and also work with leaders to value employee voice. You could have all of the data in the world, which, for instance, based in Seattle, we know that Amazon has tons of data on their employees, but they're not using it to make different decisions. They have tons of data about how women of color experience the organization or how Black engineers experience the organization, but that doesn't come into play. So if there are two takeaways from this, one is get some data, right? And use it to make decisions. The second is that that data should be employee voice and employee perspectives, and see if that can support your efforts. We've done a lot of research over the past year at Moving Beyond in learning from thousands of employees across dozens of companies about, well, what creates a climate for inclusion, what creates a climate for equity, how do we measure it, what are the kind of questions that we can ask to get there. And there are 20 or so things that we've seen that connect directly to equity and inclusion. And they are these things. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but this is a snapshot for you all to think about as you take some of this information back to your organization. And they're grouped together in ways that allows decision makers to actually gather insights that drive strategy. So access to opportunity. You're not going to have a super trusting environment, for instance, if you don't have pay equity and pay transparency, right? Because when there is a culture of secrecy around pay, you best believe that that culture of secrecy extends to many other things in your organization, right? But pay is the one that's the most noticeable. And it used to be, for some of you that are maybe older than 30 years old, it used to be in our employment contracts. 10 years ago, there was a standard line in our employment contracts that would say, you are not allowed to share your compensation information with anybody else in your organization. Within access to opportunity, we're also looking at two other things that I think are really important. One is, do I know what it's going to take for me to get promoted? Is that advancement information really clear for me? And do I feel supported by my direct manager, right? Like, people managers can make or break your experience inside of an organization. And somebody submitted a question that said, you know, what if I can't pay someone more? How can I convince them to stay at my organization? Well, if you have really great people managers, you're likely to retain people, because more than money, right, hard dollars, more than that, the relationship that you have with the person who you report into, that matters more to most people. We also ask questions about people's attitudes and values, right? And we look for three things in particular that I think personally are really important as well. Growth mindsets. Will I show up differently when I'm presented with new information, right? And I'll give you an example of who's not showing growth mindsets in this moment are all of the parents that are going to school board meetings in this like really bizarre anti-CRT movement. And I can tell you, as a former public school teacher, CRT is not part of school curricula. Like, I think most teachers couldn't tell you what it is either. But like, that's an example of like not having growth mindset, right? Like, somebody has presented like historical facts, and now you're saying, well, I want to learn both sides of slavery. And I don't know, are there both sides? Like, struggle to see the other side. We also want to know about what are people's attitudes towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is a super helpful point to collect data on. You want to know, like, how much of my organization believes that this work is like mission critical, right? Like, we are not successful as an organization if we're not living by these principles. And what of your organization feels like it's a distraction or a waste of time? That is going to help you make different decisions. And then finally, like, the extent to which your organization and people within it reject meritocracy, which is the idea that just simply putting in more time or more hours, you're going to be successful. And that does not take into account the many systemic barriers that are in place. We also look at a lot of like sort of quote unquote DEI factors like fairness, belonging, who is experiencing those. Does the organization have a culture of learning, or like, is it the case that people are told what to do in a super micromanaging work cultures? Who is experiencing what kinds of discrimination, and like, what are people's experience of leaders? And then finally, policies and practices. This is, if you're a DEI practitioner on this call today, you know that it's one thing to have a set of policies and practices, and it's a whole other thing that they're being utilized, right? And so how do people experience their performance evaluation? Does it feel transparent? What what is in place to have work-life balance, work-life management, right? And who gets it and who doesn't get it. So these are some of the things that we look at. And, like a bunch of you asked questions about, well, what tools are available? We have a tool, but also this is a framework for you to even organically start to gather questions around and test it with your organization. And my very last slide is, I want to tell you like what happens, right? When you use data to not only inform DEI work, but like ultimately build super solid, trusting, accountable cultures. One is you get to upend assumptions about who's having the best experience, right? I think I hear a lot of people say, and I used to be somebody who would say, well, white men are having a great time. And in lots of organizations where we're working in, like white men are having the saddest experience. Like they are untethered. Like they no longer know their place. And it's an assumption that they're having a good time. Like they were struggling, right? So what work do we need to do to like shore them up and have them show up as allies? It makes it possible for you to make sure underrepresented groups aren't lost in when you're designing initiatives, right? And you need to know what people's experiences are so that you know whether you need to start an ERG for parents, or do you need to start an ERG for veterans, or do you like, right? Like who are you going to program for? And then finally, like what gets measured is what gets funded and what gets done. And so having data in place, especially year on year, will also help you see, are we making progress? Are we being successful? Or are we just throwing a lot of hot air in a really beautiful, yearly report designed by some fabulous designer? Like what is really happening? So that's what's possible. And I think so much more, but I'll take a pause now and ask what's coming up for you all. What are you curious about?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for setting the stage. So fascinating. Everything that you're presenting and the integrity behind it, the curiosity behind it, the realness behind it too. I love that you highlighted to make sure that, that this isn't just, hot air blowing up in some beautiful designer package where we think we're on track, but we haven't really held ourselves accountable by setting, these systems into place. So much to dive in here. I just want to remind our live callers, we want to hear from you. Her presentation set up a lot of questions for me, so I'm sure it did for you as well. Feel free to drop that in the chat box. And I might hold for a light pause somewhere in between if folks want to hop off mute. So be looking out for that invitation. All right, so let's start with this first question here. I think this really brings us to, the reality that we're facing, having been through this experience and still deeply going through this experience of the pandemic here, with lots of folks having epiphanies, I think, maybe, career pivoting or expecting more of this, of equity, especially financial equity. Someone wrote in the chat box when you were speaking about how you said like 10 years ago, you were specifically told to not share your how much you're getting paid. And Monica writes, so many organizations still discourage or prohibit discussing compensation, doesn't matter if it's illegal or not. So, finding ways to just sneak around for essentially saving your ass and making it seem like you're doing what the public is asking you to do. So lots of folks are, looking for new jobs, looking to career pivot, looking to start their own career. So this first question reads, what are your key pieces of advice to build trust when facing mass resignation?
Oh man, I don't know if I have any, to be honest, because by the time you have people resigning, it's too late. It's like when you've eaten your fifth piece of pie and you have regrets. Well, that pie is in your tummy and it's there. So what can you do differently, right? Like the next day you can make an effort to maybe have a manageable portion of dessert, right? So people are leaving. I think you really need to shore up and build up morale for the people that are staying, with the recognition that they're now going to do double work, right? Because hiring is not something that happens overnight. So if you are in fact in an organization where there are mass resignations, I would take a pause, really get a beat on the ones that are staying and how to make them happy. And this is advice that's contrary to like the profit incentive of so many businesses, but taking a pause, right? Sometimes you have to take a short-term loss so that you can shore up your organization. And that's something that I've seen a handful of companies do this past year, where they've said, you know what, we're going to eat our profits for 6 weeks, or we're going to eat our profits for 2 months. We're really going to slow things down, take care of the people that are staying, ask them what they need, and then build up from there.
Beautiful. I think that, thanks for the transparency as well by saying you don't have all the answers. And I love in your introduction that you did the air quotes of being an expert, because I don't think that any of us are experts. We're all figuring it out. And maybe some of us have more knowledge because we've acquired more knowledge by deciding to, study something or something like that. But I really appreciate the call out there. I love that you also mentioned in your introduction that this has become did you say $8 billion sector just with the diversity, equity, inclusion? That gives me hope. And hopefully, more folks like you who want to, help people find different ways to approach this work with more integrity and more being willing to put people over profits and eat your profits, like you said, sometimes. I think that gives me hope, and hopefully more of us can understand how to do this work on a personal level and, within our teams, and especially for leaders, because we do see that there can be another wave of income flow that hopefully will support more people than not. So actually, I just this is a good time to highlight a live question here. Danita writes, what are some experiments that can be done to rebuild trust?
Oh my gosh. Well, Danita has, I will just say, a lot more experience than I do. She's a veteran HR leader.
I'll come on camera. Only for you, Aparna. Only for you, I'll come on camera.
Yeah. So I don't know what experiments can be done. I mean, it depends so much on what is your culture today, what's the size, what's the scope. I think that we can never go wrong with asking people what they need to feel successful and taking it at face value, like literally that question, right? Like, what will help you feel successful, and how do I keep you? What is it going to take? And they might say, well, you need to pay me 50% more. That may not be possible. But certainly if somebody says, I need to be able to work from home more, and this is a struggle that I'm seeing right now, and I'm sure, Danita, you are too, where employers really want butts in seats and employees really want to continue to have flexibility. Give them flexibility, right? That's one. The other is, and Brene Brown talks about it, and a lot of other people talk about it, the idea of power over and power with. And so if you have an organizational style that's very much power over, one thing to experiment with is, what does it mean to have power with your employees? You don't have to own 100% of the decisions. And that was a piece of advice that I got at 21 in my very first teaching job in West Chicago, a bazillion years ago, 15 years ago, where a senior teacher in the school said, remember, it's going to go easier if you share power with your students. You're not the boss. You're a facilitator. You're a conduit. And I think it would behoove leaders to follow that.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Danita, did you want to chime in? Maybe you have some experiments to bring to the table as well?
No.
All right. Well, thank you for asking that question.
No, it's a Aparna show. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm ready. If you're holding back because you want to go deep, I always love going deep. So
yeah, don't hold
unleash.
back.
This is a really good start. It really does. Excuse me. It really does depend on the organization, right? So what is it that the organization is trying to get at to, and the pre-work to that is to chip at the trust piece, and really not look at the surface level of the symptoms that you're seeing, but really going deep. Like Aparna says, use the data from your organization. And if you don't have data, use the experiments to create your own data. Don't go out and try to grab it from someone else that doesn't represent or isn't exactly like your organization. Because we all want that. Like we all want, let me go get this data set. Why doesn't it work here? Because it's not your world. So that's the only piece, but Aparna's right. Use that data for your insights and to inform. And for some, depending upon your organization and your position, use it to drive you. But as leaders, you're using it to inform your strategy, not necessarily drive it, because you've got to also have, and that data is qualitative and quantitative. So Aparna's right on. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Looking forward to connecting.
I would also say that, there's no like magic bullet. There's no tool that's going to do it for you and certainly nothing that's going to do it for you overnight. Right. And so if you make, software purchasing decisions in your company, or if you influence them, I can guarantee you can implement Culture Amp or Lattice or Peakon or some new module in Workday, and it's not going to cut it, because human beings are deeply relational. They're deeply relational. And even if people can't name what equity looks like in practice or in policies, everybody knows what fair feels like. And asking people what fair feels like is going to just go such a long way.
So I love even Danita has gotten a little deeper with making sure that we can own our power by taking a different perspective, right? So not saying, let me grab, like she said, not grabbing this data set from someone else that has a different, reality and probably maybe even a different vision, and trying to collect that data or find data that speaks, that is you on the billboard. We've done, a lot of people of color have had to do so much work to see themselves because this person doesn't represent them on the billboard, on the screen, and we have to do this extra work to try to fit in that place. But it's like not about fitting into that place. This data set works for this, person or this company. How does it work from my perspective of what equity means, or diversity and inclusion? I've just recently taken a beautiful workshop that's called Crafting Your Equity Lens from Matthew Reynolds. He's a beautiful being I interviewed here, and then I discovered the work that he's doing. And it really shows you that everyone has a different perspective, and that we can all, practice more active listening and just be more intentional about truly rebuilding trust and coming together. So I want to dig deeper there on analyzing these results, as this question rings to that. So could you provide some guidance on how to analyze the assessment's results? Once we understand them, how can we take action?
Yeah, well, one thing that everybody should be doing in 2021, if you're not doing it, that's a red flag, which is disaggregate your data. Just do not do the lazy thing where you're like, on average, we have an 81% satisfaction rate. And I'm like, well, who is your average, right? If you're an organization that's either predominantly white or predominantly male, or whatever identity is the largest representation, your average is going to tell you how that group is feeling. And when you disaggregate, it lets you see how people are experiencing the organization differently, and you are going to see some real peaks and valleys in your data. If you don't see them, I don't know, like you are hiring robots, right? Like your workers are zombies. It's not going to be the case where everybody's having the same experience. And so like that's one, disaggregate your data. The second is engage leadership and decision makers in making sense of it. Data is hopefully just a set of facts, right? Whether it's qualitative or quantitative, but insights require context, and you want to use those insights to inform decisions or to inform strategy. And the people inside of organizations are the ones that have the context, right? So 3 different organizations, for instance, could say that they have a really high turnover intention, which basically means lots of people, if offered a similar job elsewhere, will leave. That, right? Like they have low intention to stay. 3 different organizations could have that for 3 very different reasons. right? Like sometimes organizations have that because they're not paying people enough, like plain and simple. Sometimes organizations have that because they're in a sector where, for instance, like you might be doing research in a hospital, but you could go do the same research for big pharma for 2 or 3x the salary. So people are leaving simply because there are other opportunities that pay significantly better, right? So the context that you have of your organization is what's going to give you the best insights, and that requires conversation. And so my recommendation is set up lots of meetings over like a month or a 6-week period to like actually just dig in, think about it, dig in, think about it. I really hate sort of like the big consulting approach where you do an assessment, for instance, and then you get an 100-page report. We have a client whose prior consultant produced a 132-page summary report. Who the hell is reading that? Who is reading that? I'm not reading that. I mean, maybe I am reading that. Nobody wants to read it. It's not actionable. It's not useful, right? Like be lean, be scrappy, meet, talk about it. And that's going to help you see what are the 2 or 3 things, maybe 5 things I want to work on that you can put some KPIs around, put a plan around, and go test it.
Beautiful. Thank you for that thorough response. Okay, Cindy, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead and hop off mute and you can ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, so throughout the session, I've been trying to formulate this into a question, and I'm sure, Aparna, as you understand, good questions lead to good answers, right? So I'll try. So we talked a lot about trust. How do we build trust as employees with leadership to create change? And how about if we reverse that? How do we trust that corporate America and big organizations want to change? And I ask that because based on my experiences and also my circle of practitioners, people are realizing that there's this phenomenon where corporate America is hiring a lot of chief diversity officer and teams, but they want people who are safe. They want people who would make it seem as though they are doing some changes, but at the same time, not too quote unquote radical, right? And so, but that's the change that we want. We want systemic change. And so I guess my question there would be like, how do you see trust coming into play there, and data as well? Do you think data is basically the solution?
Is data the solution? Well, I think saying data is the solution is like saying vegetables are a solution. No, well, you have to eat them, right? Like, and you have to eat less of something else, and then you kind of have a more balanced diet, right? So like, I think data is like celery. You gotta eat it, even if you hate it, and probably not with tons of peanut butter on it, which maybe is something that resonates with like US-based people that did ants on a log as children, which is a pretty disgusting situation. I don't know why y'all do it, but yeah, I mean, data offers, or data highlights what to work on, but people have to do the work, right? It's like going to the doctor's office and getting your blood work, and the blood data is like the blood work, right? So they're like, oh, your cholesterol is high or your iron is low. Okay, well, if your iron is low, you gotta fix it, right? You probably need to eat a lot of kale. So how do you know whether you can trust corporate America? I think it's safe to say that you can't. But let's say that you are an optimistic person and you're like, well, I want to try and find the right place for me to work. So what can you look for? I think look at their annual reports. And you will be able to tell pretty quickly which ones are fluff and which ones are real. And so the companies that I like that put out a really solid report every year is Slack. You can find it easily. It has a lot of detail. They have intersectional data analysis. They're not presenting information in aggregates. They're showing you the delta year on year. Where have they grown? Where have they made less progress, right? Like it's It's right there and it's easy to find. So if you are having to work really hard to find some organization's annual report, like there's a pretty good chance that you can't trust them because they haven't made that information easily available. If you're looking in the, big companies like Fortune 1000, I would also look at their ESG report. What does it look like? How much information is there? And is it stated in language that you can understand, or is it like super technically jargony? I would look at the length of some of these reports. Is it 132 pages? Man, you're not going to read it. Like, right? Are you going to go digging in 132 pages? No. So Slack to me is like kind of the gold standard. The other I really like is Vox Media. They put out a really simple web page. You just type in Vox diversity and inclusion. It's probably the very first search result that's going to come up for you. So that's one, right? In conversations with people, you can also start to ask some questions. So you could see, like, do I trust you, right? Do they have a chief diversity officer, or do they have diversity built into every leadership role? You want to go for the latter, in my opinion. What is one person going to do? Right? Like, is it built into everybody's job description? You can ask them, how does DE&I show up in performance evaluation? We use the language of rewarded, supported, and expected. So you can ask, how is diversity, equity, and inclusion, or how is a culture of employee well-being rewarded, supported, and expected? And if they're like, well, everybody's well-being is their own problem, that's a pretty big red flag, right? Or if they're like, we give people a spa day, you can be like, well, I don't know. Is that one spa day a year? Is that going to cut it for me? I would also look at some like real tactical things like policies and utilization. So a company could say, I have unlimited PTO. Okay, what's the utilization on that? On average, how many people, like how much time are people taking? I've seen companies that have unlimited PTO and the average amount of time people take off in a year is 7 days. That doesn't sound very unlimited to me, right? Versus companies that have unlimited PTO and people are taking like 3 to 5 weeks on average. That's a pretty healthy utilization rate. I would ask them, what is your parental leave policy for non-birthing parents? What is it? That'll tell you, like, do you care about gender equity? Because if you do, then you're going to give non-birthing parents a good amount of time and you're setting the expectation that they care for their human children, right? Yeah, so those are, I would say those are some things to look at.
Ooh, thank you so much for that question. I find myself asking, I just journaled the other day because I'm working on writing a book and things like that. So I wrote trust issues, circled it, I'm like contemplating on it. It's like, yeah, I've got a lot. I got major trust issues. I don't even live in the States right now, which there's so much therapy to do there with why am I deciding to not when I was born there? Why am I deciding to live here? And a lot of the trust issue comes up, with the pharmaceutical companies, with miseducation, all the things. Like, you worked in education. I know that you know a lot of things that are kept out of the media, but I love that you are just bringing us back to empowering ourselves to ask these tough questions, and hopefully, knowing that this isn't our only, if this company that we're currently working with or that we're interviewing with, if they say, no, we actually don't have those things into place, that it's not the end of the world. And actually, maybe it's the first step in the right direction into us asking for more accountability and then receiving more of that as well. So I really appreciate that question. I know it was a hard reflection, Aparna, to give. And in general, I think that, I don't know, something came up that was interesting during that moment. It's like, it makes it more about an individual, like the independence and the true, freedom to do whatever the work that it is we're deciding to do, that comes into play. Instead of expecting trust, like the reverse question that she made, how should we expect to trust? Maybe the answer is no, like you said. And in that case, well, why are we still buying from these companies or working at these companies? Maybe we can be a drop in the pond to some extent. And then how do we do that? Well, that's where the curiosity comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just ranting now, but I really appreciated that impromptu question. All right, so we've got a little over 10 minutes now. I want to see if anyone else wants to hop off mute and voice a question or a reflection. If so, please do so now. I will hold for a light pause to see if someone would like to hop off mute. If not, I've got more questions, don't worry. All right, so I'll go over these questions. So time is of the essence these days. We know some of our key employees are looking for opportunities elsewhere. How can we foster belonging rapidly, if possible? What rapid changes can we apply? And before you respond to this, I really appreciate the transparency in this question. And in my personal opinion, it's one of the, I know, it's just one of the big conundrums of industry. It's like, how do we push the button to end racism? How do we push the button that's going to end? Like you said, there's no silver, line here, or hopefully there's a silver lining, but there's no silver bullet, as you said. So this question that starts with time is of the essence. And I think that's just because how we value productivity and what, the status quo says success is. And so we want to get there. We want to get there fast. So how do we create belonging fast? What's your response to that, Aparna?
I just don't think that that's possible. Put rapid in front of anything else and it's going to sound hokey, right? And that, think of when you see ads for rapid weight loss in the holiday seasons, we're seeing that a lot. It's hokey. It's hokey. You got to put the work in. If that's the thing that you want, I'm not suggesting you should want it, but if that's what you want, you got to put your time in. You have to have the discipline. I think there's a lot of performative belonging that I see. Belonging has become deeply commodified and productized over the last couple of years. You can't. You can't. What you can change are how often you check in with your people. That you can change hopefully pretty quickly. You can change some policies and practices rapidly, should you want. But fostering belonging, that deep sense of feeling like this is my place, that just takes time.
Yes. So in that case, yes, time is of the essence, and to be patient, right? And intentional. So just because we've got about 10 minutes left, this was one of the final questions, but you're kind of hinting to that already. How can we avoid implementing performative DEI policies? So I'm happy that you said that that's one of the things you can change quickly, are your policies. You can go in there right now, open your docs and make those changes now. But just to dive deeper there, this question reads, how can we avoid implementing performative DEI policies?
Yeah. Well, just don't do it. That's, I mean, what I said earlier.
It's like the drug ad, just say no.
Just say no. It didn't really work for DARE. Yeah. How do you avoid implementing performative DEI policies? I think somebody said earlier, and it may have been Sinyi who said, companies want to do what's palatable, right? And having performative policies is palatable. Nothing really changes. It's in name only. And when that's happening, I think the courage to call it out is a big one. Also being ready to offer something different. So if we're not going to do X, what will we do that's different? Knowing that, I think, is often really helpful. And, to the extent possible, going to employees and asking them what's going to work for them. Now, the caveat in that is, what if you have an organization that's really split and you have a big contingent of your workforce that's very all lives matter? Do their voices also matter? And to some extent, yes. So this is a hard one. I would say, and maybe somebody can just look it up. There's an organization called the Impact Management Project. And as an evaluator, I have used their 5 questions pretty extensively in my professional career. And they are really good questions. So I would ask questions around, who is it for? What are we aiming to do? right? What do we think will change as a result of this intervention? Name it and measure it. And then what is the risk to impact? Can we name that risk to impact? And for instance, our risk to impact is people that are making policy decisions don't reflect the workforce, for instance. That's a risk to impact. You're not going to get there. Or a risk to impact is insufficient budget. That's the other thing that I've seen is like, we're going to have great things, but it's only going to cost us $1 per person. I mean, yeah, right? Like you can't even buy a candy bar for $1 anymore. So I would ask some smart questions of the people that are making decisions.
And don't be afraid to ask those questions, right? Especially if you're in the and lots of folks who listen to Power to Fly, the chats and just read the articles and attend virtual events are looking to interview, looking to get hired, looking to pivot careers. And I love just bringing it up to everyone's awareness that it is expected of you to ask these questions. You know, don't just try to not ask questions or answer all the questions correctly to your, however you think correctly is, and not get into the juice of it, because then you're going to end up being unhappy or being burnt out or realizing that you made the wrong choice. So just to like out of the gate, ask these chewy questions. So we've got about 7 minutes left. I want to thank everyone for utilizing the chat box. I see folks dropping their preferred ways of connecting, and Marta's been dropping links to things you've been mentioning here. Danita as well has been giving us some good feedback. So thank you so much, everyone. I think that a nice question to reflect on, just to wrap this conversation up, would be to get to this question that, as you said, this is a really, this is a new industry, unfortunately, but, what better time than now, the diversity, equity, inclusion industry. So for people who are looking to enter into this space, this question kind of reads to them. How can we encourage them? What is your advice to folks who are looking to enter this space of intersectionality between diversity, equity, inclusion, organizational design, and analytics?
Oh, well, that's the best kind of DEI work there is. Yeah, what is my advice for folks looking to enter in this space? Well, one, I think that you have to carve it for yourself. I don't think that there are, and certainly I don't see very many job descriptions where the DEI practitioner is also being asked to have inputs around organizational design and development. And certainly data in DEI is very nascent, very, very nascent. The best things that you can do is to network with people who have some of those jobs. If you're at a company that you really love, start carving out a space and expertise. I would say get really strong in your real tactical skills, right? And that's something that's missing in the DEI space. A lot of practitioners are kind of woo, they're very training and relationship based. And we have to balance that with policies, practices, very real data analysis skills. And that for some of you may come really easy. You could pivot table like nobody's business, or you're a Power BI and Tableau expert. For others of us, it's going to take work to grow that skill set. And so be proactive, use your professional development dollars to get trained in those things. Because for most companies, upskilling their existing workforce is always going to be a better investment than trying to find somebody from the outside. Because remember, you have the context of the organization, and because every organization is unique, knowing the operational parameters is going to make you really good at this, rather than them bringing somebody from the outside that's going to take 9 months to onboard.
And do you have any recommendations for how to set up boundaries when entering into this space? Because I know that, let's say that there was, as people refer to when they submit their questions, they are one of the onlys and they're expected, or maybe they want to bring, take up space in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, but then they end up taking on another job because there's, of course, so much to just discover. So how can a person just make sure that they are well so that they can, develop more of the initiative there by setting their boundaries?
Well, I'm somebody who sucks at boundary setting of any sort. That's why I agreed to give this talk after a holiday weekend. Right? Thank you for joining me. Yeah, I mean, setting boundaries is really hard, right? And I hear from a lot of people, especially women of color, who have like their own full job, and then they have some like 30 hours a month that they're putting towards DEI efforts. That's entirely volunteer. And they're doing it because they so desperately want their workplaces to change, right? And I could say, yeah, I discourage that and have better boundaries. And sometimes that's what it takes. And some of my mentors have often said to me, like, what are you complaining about? Right? Like rest, recover, and get back at it. That's just kind of how you need to do it. But some of the kinds of questions that you can ask is, can this be part of my job responsibilities? Can we update my job description if I'm spending, 0.25% of my time on this, so that I get bonused and, rated on this being part of my core work? You can ask, what resources are available to me? Like, for instance, can I borrow someone's admin time or project coordinator time to be able to do this work? I think you could certainly try saying, I don't do evenings and weekends, and see how that pans out, right? And in a lot of cases, people will say, well, if you care about it, then you'll just do it. You'll just do it on your own time, which is not okay. I come back to what is expected, supported, and rewarded. And I would put those three words, expected, supported, and rewarded, on sticky notes and put it on your desk. And so when something comes up, you can say, well, how am I supported, or how am I rewarded for this? Or what support am I going to get to start this new ERG? Will I have a budget, or will I be asking my friends for favors?
Yes, yes. I love this whole conversation. You're asking us to just question everything and be more curious. And I think that what that does is it brings us back to our center as much as we can. Of course, we all work on our boundaries. Aparna, thank you for being here. Danita also wrote in the chat box, thank you for being here when after the holidays and you're here, speaking. But I think, again, you are, of course we can say we all need to work on our boundaries, but I think when you're passionate about a subject and you say yes because you want to share, and right now you're sharing your voice, you're sharing resources, folks are being able to connect more on this note. And I think it's, such a beautiful thing to see digitally, digital community happening in such uncertain times. So thank you so much for stretching your boundaries for us today. This has been a great talk. Can you remind us how we can connect with you when we finish this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn. And you could also just shoot me an email, or both. I'm at aparna@movingbeyond.co. Please don't be afraid to reach out if you want the slides or whatever it is. We're here for it.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's joined us live today. We'll see you on the next